Ryker was 72 when it happened. He'd always been the kind of man who believed health was a matter of common sense. A walk around the block every morning, fresh fruit on the table, a pot of oatmeal simmering on the stove. And of all the foods he trusted, blueberries were at the top of his list. Every morning without fail, he would toss a handful into his yogurt, stir in a spoonful of honey, and enjoy the way the tart sweet burst filled his mouth. It was a ritual he thought would carry him well into old age. But that morning in late spring, something shifted, not dramatically at first, but enough to make him pause. It started as a dull ache low in his belly, the kind you could almost ignore. Ryker brushed it off, thinking maybe it was a touch of indigestion from a heavier dinner the night before. But as the days went by, the discomfort grew sharper, more insistent, almost like a small knot tightening inside him. By the end of the week, he found himself pushing away his breakfast halfway through, appetite dulled by waves of nausea. His wife, Ellen, noticed the color in his face fading, replaced by a pale, almost gray undertone. "You're not yourself," she said softly, a crease of worry between her brows. Ryker had never been quick to run to the doctor, but when the pain began waking him at night, when he caught himself leaning over the kitchen counter just to catch his breath, he agreed to let Ellen drive him to the clinic. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, and the ticking of the clock seemed louder than it should. After a few tests, the doctor came in with that particular careful tone Ryker recognized from his years of life experience, the tone people use when they're about to tell you something you don't want to hear. The lab results showed his liver enzymes were elevated, not just a little, but alarmingly so. The doctor asked about his medications, his supplements, his diet. When Ryker proudly mentioned his morning yogurt and blueberry habit, the doctor's brow furrowed. "And you said you take an iron supplement for anemia?" Ryker nodded. That was when the pieces began to fall into place. The doctor explained, gently but firmly, that certain compounds in blueberries could bind with iron in a way that not only blocked absorption, but also left damaging deposits in the liver. Ryker felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. How could something as harmless, as healthy, as blueberries turn against him? He thought of all the mornings he had eaten them without a second thought, believing they were keeping him strong. There was a strange betrayal in the idea, like discovering an old friend had been quietly working against you all along. Ellen reached for his hand, squeezing it as the doctor outlined a plan. Separate the blueberries and the iron by several hours, run follow-up blood work, and monitor his liver function closely. That night, Ryker lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Ellen's soft breathing filled the quiet. He felt an odd mix of gratitude that they had caught it early, and unease, realizing how much of his health was balanced on choices he'd never questioned. He thought about friends his age who had their own routines, their own trusted foods. How many of them, he wondered, were unknowingly making the same mistake? It was a question that lodged deep in his mind, refusing to be set aside. Over the next few weeks, Ryker made the changes the doctor recommended. He pushed his iron supplements to the evening and saved blueberries for a mid-morning snack, paired with a slice of whole grain toast instead of yogurt. Slowly, the tightness in his belly eased. His energy returned, enough that he felt like taking longer walks again, this time along the river trail where the air smelled of pine and fresh water. At his follow-up appointment, his liver numbers had improved, and for the first time in months, the doctor smiled when she looked at his chart. But more than the relief of recovery, Ryker carried something else with him, a new awareness, a sharper curiosity about the foods he ate and how they interacted. He began reading more, asking questions at the farmer's market, even striking up conversations with strangers about their favorite recipes. "It's not about being afraid of what's on your plate," he told Ellen one evening as they watched the sun dip low over the trees. "It's about knowing enough to make it work for you, not against you." One afternoon, he met his old fishing buddy Frank at the cafe in town. Frank, like Ryker, was in his 70s, still sharp and full of stories. As they talked over steaming mugs of tea, Frank mentioned he'd been feeling more tired lately, maybe from the heat. Ryker found himself leaning forward, asking about his diet, his supplements, the small habits that made up his mornings. When Frank mentioned blueberries with his fortified cereal, Ryker felt a pang of recognition. He didn't lecture, that was never his way, but he shared his own story, the quiet warning tucked in between the sips of tea and the easy laughter of old friends. In telling it, Ryker realized something important. What had started as a personal scare had turned into a kind of mission, not to frighten people away from healthy foods, but to help them see that even the best intentions could carry hidden traps. It wasn't about giving up what you loved, but about making small shifts that could mean the difference between thriving in your 70s and watching your health slip away, piece by piece, without ever knowing why. That understanding would guide him in the months ahead as he learned more about food pairings, the quiet science behind them, and the subtle ways they could tip the balance toward health or harm. And as he would soon discover, blueberries were just the beginning of a much larger story. Ryker woke early that morning to the soft hum of Ellen's kettle and the muted glow of dawn creeping through the curtains. He had always liked this quiet time of day before the clatter of town life began, when the only sounds were the rustle of leaves outside and the familiar clink of a spoon in his cereal bowl. He moved through his routine without thinking, the warm swirl of yogurt in the glass dish, the drizzle of honey, and finally, the tumble of plump blueberries cascading in like a handful of sapphires. It had been his breakfast for years, his little insurance policy against aging. At 72, he was proud of how spry he still felt, how steady his hands were when he poured his tea. But that morning, something was off. The first spoonful felt fine, but by the third, a sharp pang pulsed low in his abdomen. It was quick, almost like the sudden cramp you get from eating too fast, so he ignored it. Ellen noticed, though. "You're eating slower," she said, glancing up from her crossword. Ryker waved it off with a half smile. "Just thinking about the fishing trip with Frank," he lied. Yet as he swallowed, he felt another twinge, this one lingering, making him shift in his chair. The ache followed him through the day. It wasn't enough to stop him from walking to the post office or tending the small patch of tomatoes in the garden, but it was there, a reminder that something wasn't quite right. By evening, the discomfort had climbed into a dull throb, wrapping around his middle like an unwelcome belt. He told himself it was nothing, that maybe the yogurt had gone a little sour, but in the back of his mind, a quiet unease had started to stir. 2 days later, Ryker woke to find the ache stronger, joined by a faint queasiness that made him push away his plate after only a few bites. Ellen's eyes, usually quick to soften with understanding, now narrowed with concern. "You've lost color," she said, touching his cheek. "And you're moving slower." Ryker wanted to dismiss it. He'd always been the sturdy one, the one who didn't fuss. But even he couldn't ignore the way fatigue seemed to settle into his bones like dampness in the walls. It wasn't until the third morning, when he sat at the kitchen table staring at his untouched bowl of blueberries, that Ellen spoke in the tone he couldn't refuse. "We're going to the clinic, Ryker, today." He opened his mouth to protest, then shut it again. There was something in her voice, the kind of quiet resolve you don't argue with, and he realized he didn't have the strength to fight her on it. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic, the walls a pale beige meant to soothe, but doing little to quiet the anxiety gnawing at him. The nurse took his vitals, the doctor asked the usual questions, and then there were tests, blood drawn, samples taken, machines humming. Ryker sat on the crinkled paper of the exam bed, staring at the floor, tiles, tracing their patterns to keep from thinking too much. When the doctor returned, she held the clipboard like a shield. Her voice was calm, but edged with that careful cadence he recognized, the one people use when delivering news they'd rather not. "Your liver enzymes are high," she began, "not dangerously so, but high enough that we need to find out why." She asked about his medications, his supplements, his diet. Ryker listed them out, feeling oddly self-conscious, as though she might judge him for his choices. When he mentioned his morning iron supplement for anemia, followed by his yogurt and blueberry breakfast, her brow knit into a small frown. "You take them together?" she asked. Ryker nodded. That was when the conversation shifted. She explained gently that blueberries, for all their benefits, contain compounds that can bind with iron in a way that both blocks absorption and leaves harmful deposits in the liver. "It's not common knowledge," she said, "but in certain cases, especially with supplements, it can cause real damage over time." She wasn't accusing, but Ryker felt the words land heavy. For a moment, he just sat there, letting the idea sink in. Blueberries had been his quiet source of pride, the food he trusted to keep him well. And now here was the suggestion, no, the truth, that they might have been part of the problem all along. Ellen reached over and covered his hand with hers. "We'll fix it," she said softly. The doctor outlined the plan: separate the blueberries and the iron by several hours, retest in a few weeks, monitor his liver closely. It sounded simple enough, but Ryker felt an odd ripple of betrayal deep inside. How could something so good turn against him? He thought of the mornings ahead, the same soft light, the same table, but the absence of that handful of berries he'd come to associate with vitality. That night at home, Ryker found himself moving slower, not from the discomfort, but from the weight of the new awareness. He stood at the counter, running his fingers over the smooth surface of the kitchen bowl where the blueberries usually sat. Ellen busied herself with making tea, her quiet presence a comfort in the hum of the evening. "We'll figure out new routines," she said, not looking up, as though she'd already been turning the problem over in her mind. Ryker nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it yet. Change, especially at his age, felt like a mountain you weren't sure you could climb until you were halfway up. But beneath the hesitation was something else, a faint, stubborn spark that had carried him through other storms in life. Maybe, he thought, this was just another trail he'd learned to walk. The morning after the doctor's warning, Ryker stood in the kitchen staring at the small bowl of fruit Ellen had set out. There were blueberries, of course, plump, dark, and shining, but beside them sat a wedge of orange, bright and cheerful. For years, he'd often had them together, thinking the citrus gave a refreshing lift to the berries. Now, after what he'd learned, that simple pairing looked different. He could almost hear the doctor's voice explaining how the acid from citrus and the acid from blueberries could combine into something harsh, stripping away enamel and irritating the lining of the gut. It wasn't poison in the dramatic sense, but for someone his age, with the kind of dental work and digestive sensitivity he carried, it was a quiet, creeping harm. He picked up a segment of orange and rolled it between his fingers. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured to Ellen. "How you can eat something for decades and only later learn it's been chipping away at you." She glanced over from the stove, her expression thoughtful. "It's not that the food's bad," she said. "It's that together they do something your body doesn't like." Ryker nodded, appreciating the balance in her words. It was true. Both were healthy on their own. But that didn't erase the image in his mind of acid slowly wearing down teeth or the tight burn of reflux he'd brushed off more than once after breakfast. That day, he decided to pay closer attention. After his walk, he stopped by the small dental clinic near the library, where he'd been going for cleanings twice a year. Dr. Hensley, a kind woman with a knack for explaining things in plain English, examined his teeth and showed him a chart. The enamel on some of his molars was thinner than it should be, the edges slightly translucent. "It's not urgent," she said, "but it's something to be mindful of. Acid erosion doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow, steady process." When he mentioned his morning fruit combination, she gave a small, knowing nod. "That would do it," she said, "especially if you don't rinse your mouth or drink water after." The thought stayed with him as he walked home. He remembered the occasional mouth sores, the sensitivity when he sipped hot tea, the faint metallic taste after certain meals. They'd always seemed like small inconveniences, nothing worth changing for. But now, with the knowledge of what was causing them, they felt heavier, signs he should have noticed sooner. It wasn't just about teeth either. The doctor had warned him that for some people, the acid overload could travel deeper, irritating the esophagus and, over time, even increasing the risk of more serious issues. That evening, Ryker sat at the kitchen table while Ellen sliced apples for a snack. "So no more blueberries and oranges together," he said, half to himself. She smiled. "We can still have both, just not at the same time. Think of it as letting each shine on its own." He liked that way of putting it. There was something almost respectful about giving each food its own space, like letting two strong voices sing solo instead of talking over each other. Over the next week, he experimented. Blueberries in the mid-morning after his walk, citrus in the late afternoon when the sun cast a warm light across the kitchen counter. The small change surprised him. The reflux he'd quietly endured for years faded, the tender spot in his gums eased, and even his energy felt steadier. He realized how much of his discomfort he had simply accepted as part of aging when, in truth, it was often the result of choices he could adjust. One afternoon, Frank stopped by with a bag of groceries. He pulled out a container of blueberries and a net of grapefruits, grinning. "Figured I'd stock you up," he said. Ryker hesitated for just a second before explaining what he'd learned. Frank listened, eyebrows raised. "You're telling me my favorite breakfast could be wrecking my teeth?" Ryker didn't say it quite that bluntly. Instead, he told him about the dental chart, the doctor's warning, and the difference he'd felt in just a week. Frank didn't promise to change, but he did set the fruit down a little more thoughtfully than before. By the end of the month, separating his fruits had become second nature. Ryker didn't feel deprived. If anything, he felt more in control. The habit carried with it a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from catching a problem early and steering yourself gently onto a better path. It was a reminder that small adjustments, made with intention, could ripple through his days in ways he hadn't expected. And though he still loved blueberries, he now saw them less as a symbol of invincibility and more as a friend you learned to respect, one you understood well enough to meet on the right terms. The shift in Ryker's mornings felt subtle at first. The blueberries were still there, but the bright wedges of orange or grapefruit had vanished from the same plate. He hadn't realized until now how often he'd paired them, on summer afternoons in the garden, at Sunday brunches with Ellen, even in the berry salads she made for picnics by the lake. It was a habit so woven into his life that removing it left an odd space, like a chair missing from the dining table. He wasn't sure if he missed the taste itself or the comfort of the familiar. A week into the change, Ryker felt something else, a calmness in his chest after meals. For years, he'd grown used to that faint, creeping burn that came mid-morning, especially after fruit-heavy breakfasts. He'd chalked it up to getting older, to a stomach less forgiving than it used to be. Now, without the citrus-blueberry combination, that burn had all but disappeared. The absence was a quiet relief, the kind you don't notice until it's gone, like a background hum finally silenced. One afternoon, curious to understand more, Ryker called his family doctor. She explained in her easy, measured way that it wasn't just about enamel or mouth sores. When two high-acid foods are eaten together, the acidity can overwhelm the body's natural buffering systems. For someone younger, it might mean only a bit of discomfort. But for seniors, she said, the lining of the esophagus is often thinner, more fragile. Prolonged irritation can lead to conditions that are harder to reverse. Ryker listened, absorbing each word the way he used to study the sky before a fishing trip, noting the details that might change the day's course. That evening, Ellen set out slices of apple beside the blueberries. "You seem more comfortable lately," she said. Ryker smiled. "I suppose I am. My stomach isn't fighting me anymore." She nodded, pleased, then admitted she'd been watching him closely. The way he walked, the way his voice sounded in the morning, even the color in his cheeks. "It's like you're not bracing yourself after you eat," she said. He hadn't realized he'd been doing that, tightening his shoulders, shifting in his chair to ease the pressure. It wasn't just the physical relief that surprised him. It was the small mental lift, the sense that his body was on his side again. Ryker began to look at other meals through the same lens, wondering what else he had paired out of habit rather than intention. The idea didn't feel restrictive, it felt freeing, like cleaning out a cluttered drawer and finding space you didn't know you had. One Saturday, Frank invited Ryker over for lunch. On the counter sat a bowl of mixed fruit, blueberries, strawberries, and orange segments glistening under a dusting of sugar. Ryker hesitated, then gently mentioned the acid combination. Frank grinned, shaking his head. "You and your new rules," he teased, but he reached for a second bowl and began separating the fruit without being asked. They ate in the backyard under the shade of an old maple, and Ryker found himself grateful not just for the food, but for the quiet respect in his friend's gesture. By the end of the month, avoiding citrus with blueberries wasn't a rule Ryker had to remember. It was simply part of the rhythm of his days. He didn't crave the old pairing anymore, and he didn't miss the sour edge of reflux or the uneasy tightness that used to creep in after breakfast. The change had started as a response to a problem, but it was becoming something else. Proof that small, mindful shifts could open the door to better days, one quiet meal at a time. Ryker hadn't expected a simple change in breakfast to stir so many old memories. In the weeks after separating his blueberries and citrus, he kept thinking back to the years when heartburn was just part of life. He remembered the quiet ache that used to settle in his chest after lunch, the way he'd lean back in his chair, waiting for it to pass. Back then, he'd pop an antacid without thinking, chalking it up to a heavier meal, or maybe too much coffee. It never occurred to him that something as innocent as fruit could be playing a part. One evening, as summer light stretched long into the living room, he and Ellen sat watching the local news. A segment came on about Barrett's esophagus, a condition where repeated acid irritation can change the cells lining the esophagus, sometimes leading to cancer. The doctor on the screen spoke with the same measured seriousness Ryker had heard in his own doctor's office. "Many cases start with years of untreated acid reflux," she said. Ryker felt a chill run through him. He glanced at Ellen, who was already watching him with that quiet, knowing look. Later that night, they sat at the kitchen table with mugs of chamomile tea. "Do you think that could have been me?" Ryker asked softly. Ellen reached across, taking his hand. "I think you listened in time," she said, "and that matters." But Ryker couldn't shake the thought. How many mornings, how many afternoons had he unknowingly stacked the odds against himself? He pictured the acid pooling in his chest, the slow wear on tissue too delicate to repair itself easily. At his next checkup, Ryker brought it up. His doctor listened carefully, nodding as he described the changes he'd made. "You did the right thing," she said. "The less irritation over time, the lower the risk. Your body has a remarkable ability to heal, especially when we remove the constant trigger." She didn't use frightening words, but her tone carried weight. For Ryker, it was enough to feel both relief and a renewed sense of responsibility. That responsibility extended into the small choices he made every day. When friends invited him for brunch, he quietly adjusted his plate, choosing melon or apple instead of orange alongside the berries. If anyone noticed, they didn't say much, and Ryker didn't feel the need to explain unless asked. In the rare moments he missed the tangy sweet burst of citrus with blueberries, he reminded himself of that quiet burn in his chest, the way it used to linger like an unwelcome guest. One Sunday, his granddaughter Lily visited with a tray of fruit tarts she'd made for a school project. They were beautiful, golden crusts filled with custard, topped with blueberries and slices of mandarin. She beamed as she set them on the table. Ryker smiled back, choosing one with only berries. Ellen caught his eye, a silent exchange passing between them. Later, when Lily had gone outside to play, Ellen said, "I saw you holding back." Ryker chuckled softly. "Some things," he said, "are easier to let go of than the trouble they bring." By the end of the season, the idea of protecting his esophagus had become as natural to him as brushing his teeth. It wasn't a matter of fear, it was a matter of care. And in that quiet shift, Ryker began to see how every choice, no matter how small, could tip the balance toward health or harm. The citrus-blueberry pairing was gone from his plate, but what had taken its place was something far more valuable: peace of mind and the quiet assurance that he was, at last, looking out for the parts of himself that couldn't speak until it was too late. It was a warm Saturday morning when Ellen suggested they walk down to the farmer's market. Ryker enjoyed the market, not just for the fresh produce, but for the slow, neighborly rhythm of it. He liked stopping at the bakery stall for a loaf of sourdough, chatting with the beekeeper about honey, and sampling whatever fruit was in season. That morning, the blueberries were in their prime, deep blue and dusted with that natural silver bloom. Without thinking, Ryker reached for a pint, imagining them stirred into a bowl of creamy yogurt as he had done for years. Then, mid-step, he stopped. The memory came back quickly, his doctor's explanation about dairy and blueberries, how the proteins in milk and yogurt could bind with the very compounds that made blueberries so valuable. Anthocyanins, she had called them, though Ryker preferred to think of them simply as the berry's goodness. The idea that dairy could lock that goodness away, robbing the body of its benefits, was unsettling. He realized how many mornings he'd spent pouring milk over blueberries, believing he was doing his body a favor, when in fact he might have been canceling out the best parts. Back home, he mentioned it to Ellen as she unpacked the market bags. She looked at him, puzzled. "But yogurt and fruit, that's supposed to be healthy," he smiled gently. "On their own, yes, but together? Maybe not for me." He explained how the proteins could trap the beneficial compounds, how that same reaction could cause bloating and discomfort, and even interfere with certain medicines. Ellen set down the yogurt container she'd been holding, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "Well," she said, "we'll just have to get creative." Creative they became. Instead of yogurt, Ryker tried a mid-morning plate of blueberries with a sprinkle of chopped walnuts, or sometimes alongside a slice of whole-grain bread spread with almond butter. The first week felt strange. Old habits, after all, have a way of tugging at you. But he noticed a difference. The mild heaviness he used to feel after breakfast was gone. His stomach felt calm, almost lighter, and there was a steady energy that carried him through his morning walk without the sluggish dip he sometimes battled before. One afternoon, Frank dropped by, grinning with a cup of blueberry ice cream in his hand. "Thought you'd want to join me in breaking the heat," he said. Ryker accepted the cup but took a slow, careful bite. The sweetness was pleasant, the blueberries bright against the creamy base, but he couldn't help thinking about what was missing, not in taste, but in what his body would take from it. "You know," he told Frank, I've learned there's a better way to get the good out of these berries, Frank laughed. Always the health teacher, he said. But Ryker noticed he didn't finish his ice cream, leaving a half-melted pool in the cup. As the weeks went by, Ryker began to feel a subtle pride in his adjustments. They weren't grand changes, but they were deliberate. When he saw people at the cafe stirring blueberries into milk-heavy smoothies, he didn't feel judgment, just a quiet awareness. He thought about how much of his life had been shaped by routines and how easy it was to keep doing something simply because it seemed good on the surface. The dairy blueberry habit was gone now, and with it came not just better digestion, but a new sense of agency over his choices. By the end of the month, his kitchen counter had become a small laboratory of pairings. Blueberries with oats, with dark chocolate, with sliced apples and a handful of seeds. Each one brought its own texture, its own flavor, and Ryker found himself looking forward to the variety. What had once been a single, automatic pairing had turned into an open invitation to experiment, and he realized that sometimes letting go of one comfort was the very thing that made room for something richer. Ryker had always thought of his digestion as something steady, dependable. He'd never had the kind of stomach troubles that some of his friends complained about. No sudden dashes to the bathroom, no weeks of discomfort that kept him from enjoying his meals. But as he looked back now, he realized there had been signs. The occasional bloating that made his waistband feel tight by midday. The soft cramping that came and went without explanation. Even the times when he felt a faint queasiness after lunch but brushed it off as too much coffee. It was during a follow-up visit that his doctor explained it more plainly. She told him that when certain proteins in dairy locked onto the compounds in blueberries, they didn't just cancel the benefits, they could also sit in the gut longer than they should, fermenting in ways that weren't good for him. It's like having something stuck in the pipes, she said. It doesn't block the flow completely, but it slows things down and creates byproducts that irritate the lining. Ryker winced at the thought. It wasn't a dramatic image, but it was uncomfortably easy to picture. Ellen listened carefully during the appointment, her brow furrowing. So that could explain the bloating, she asked. The doctor nodded. And over time, it can lead to increased permeability, what people sometimes call a leaky gut, that can trigger inflammation in other parts of the body. Ryker sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of it. He'd never connected the occasional ache in his knees or the stiffness in his fingers to something as small as his breakfast choices. But now, the thread seemed clearer. At home that evening, he poured himself a cup of herbal tea and sat at the kitchen table. Ellen joined him, sliding into the chair across from his. You know, she said, I used to think our bodies just got tired as we got older. But maybe it's more like they've been sending us little messages all along. Ryker smiled at that. It felt true. The messages had been there, he just hadn't known how to read them. From then on, he paid closer attention. If his stomach felt unsettled after a meal, he made a mental note of what he'd eaten. If his energy dipped in the afternoon, he thought back to the combinations he'd chosen that morning. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The simpler the pairing, blueberries with oats, or with a handful of nuts, the calmer his digestion felt. The more complicated or heavy the mix, the more likely it was that discomfort would creep in later. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch with Frank, Ryker shared what he'd learned. Frank laughed. You're turning into a food detective, he said. But Ryker just shrugged. Maybe, or maybe I'm just finally paying attention. He didn't say it out loud, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he was learning to hear his body's small signals before they became alarms. And though it started with something as ordinary as blueberries and dairy, the lesson felt much bigger, that sometimes the smallest changes could protect you from the slow, hidden damage you never knew was there. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon when Ryker first noticed something odd about his pills. He'd been on the same thyroid medication for years, a little tablet he took every morning after breakfast. It had kept his energy steady, his mind clear, and his body balanced. But lately, there had been days when a strange heaviness settled over him by mid-morning, a fog behind his eyes, as if the gears in his body were turning slower. At first, he blamed the weather or a poor night's sleep. But as the days passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was off. The realization came during a routine checkup. His doctor scanned his chart and frowned slightly. Your thyroid levels are a bit low, she said. Have you missed any doses? Ryker shook his head. Not once. She asked him to walk her through his mornings. He described how he took his iron supplement in the early evening now, how blueberries had shifted to a mid-morning snack, Then he mentioned, almost in passing, the yogurt parfait he'd been eating again some mornings. Blueberries layered with thick Greek yogurt, sometimes with honey drizzled on top. Her brow furrowed. "That could be it," she said. "Dairy can interfere with the absorption of certain medications, including yours. If the medication binds to the proteins in milk, it doesn't get into your system properly." Ryker blinked, taken aback. It wasn't the first time he'd heard about food and medicine clashing. The iron in blueberries had taught him that. But he hadn't realized yogurt could be sabotaging the pills he relied on every day. On the drive home, he felt a mix of frustration and relief. Frustration that something so small had been quietly undoing the medicine's work. Relief that he had found the answer before the problem grew worse. He thought back to the fatigue that had crept in, the sluggish afternoons, the occasional brain fog. They hadn't been random after all, they were signals. That evening, Ellen listened patiently as he explained what the doctor had said. "So now what?" she asked. Ryker smiled faintly. "Now I make space. No dairy for at least 4 hours after the pill." Ellen nodded, already rearranging the breakfast menu in her mind. "You'll get your yogurt at lunch instead," she said. Within a week of changing the timing, Ryker felt the difference. The heavy mornings lifted. His energy returned to its steady rhythm, his thoughts sharper, his body lighter. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden burst of vitality, but it was the kind of quiet stability he valued most. It reminded him that health wasn't just about what you took in, but about when and how you took it. One Sunday, while talking to Frank over tea, Ryker shared the discovery. Frank, who took heart medication, looked thoughtful. "I never thought about my breakfast getting in the way," he admitted. Ryker leaned back, a small smile playing at his lips. "Neither did I. But now I think about it every day." And for Ryker, that awareness had become its own form of medicine, one that didn't come in a bottle, but in the shape of choices made with care. Ryker first heard about Margaret at the clinic during a quiet conversation with his doctor. She'd mentioned the case not to frighten him, but to show how easily good intentions could turn into hidden danger. Margaret was 72, like Ryker, a retired schoolteacher from a small town just 2 hours away. She'd been known in her neighborhood for her brisk morning walks and her habit of making bright, colorful smoothies every day. Blueberries were always the star, deep blue against the creamy backdrop of yogurt, sometimes with a squeeze of orange or a handful of spinach. Her trouble began when she was diagnosed with mild anemia. The doctor had prescribed iron supplements, and like many people, she'd read that vitamin C could help her body absorb iron better. So, without a second thought, she started blending the supplements right into her morning blueberry smoothie, believing she was giving her health an extra boost. At first, she felt proud of herself. Here was a simple habit that seemed both nourishing and smart. But within weeks, something began to change. Margaret started feeling a deep, twisting ache in her abdomen, the kind that made her pause in the middle of simple tasks. Nausea followed, robbing her of her appetite. She lost weight without trying, her skin taking on a faint gray cast. Even the sparkle in her eyes dulled. When she finally went to the hospital, the tests told a sobering story. Her liver enzymes were 5 times higher than normal, and scans showed iron deposits scattered through her liver tissue. The culprit was a reaction she'd never heard of. The polyphenols and tannins in blueberries were binding to the iron in her supplements, creating complexes her body couldn't absorb or easily clear. Instead of feeding her cells, the iron was sitting in her organs, slowly causing damage. She thought she was helping herself, Ryker's doctor had said softly, but she was making the problem worse. Ryker felt a pang of recognition when he heard that. He imagined Margaret standing in her sunny kitchen, pouring the deep purple smoothie into a glass, unaware that each sip was carrying more harm than help. It could have been him. It could have been any of his friends, neighbors, or even Ellen. The difference was only that his own doctor had caught the pattern before it took root. Margaret's recovery hadn't been easy. The doctors had to separate her blueberries and iron supplements by many hours, start her on a gentle chelation therapy to pull the excess iron from her liver, and monitor her closely. It took 4 months before her liver numbers returned to normal. Even then, the experience had left its mark, not just in her medical chart, but in the way she approached every meal, every pill, every choice about what went into her body. That night, Ryker sat at his own kitchen table, Ellen beside him, thinking about Margaret. She was doing everything she thought was right, he said quietly. Ellen reached over, her hand warm over his. "So were you," she replied. "The difference is, you learned in time." Ryker nodded, feeling both grateful and unsettled. Margaret's story had taught him something he wouldn't forget, that even the healthiest habits deserve a closer look, and that sometimes the line between helping and harming is thinner than you'd ever imagine. Ryker couldn't stop thinking about the image the doctor had described, those iron deposits in Margaret's liver, tiny flecks scattered like rust in the grain of a once smooth surface. It wasn't a violent injury, not the kind you could see or feel all at once. It was slow, almost polite in the way it crept in, laying down layers over weeks and months until the organ's delicate machinery began to strain under the weight. That image stuck with him because he knew how easily it could have been his own story. One evening, he sat in his armchair by the window, the lamplight pooling over the open pages of a book he wasn't really reading. Ellen was in the kitchen, humming as she dried the dishes. "Do you think damage like that ever fully heals?" he asked suddenly. She paused, leaning against the doorway. "The doctors say your body can repair a lot if you give it the chance," she said, "but I think some things always leave a mark." Ryker knew she wasn't just talking about the liver. The next day, during a follow-up appointment, he asked his doctor more about it. She explained how the liver, remarkable as it was, had its limits. "Iron is tricky," she said. "Your body needs it, but too much, especially trapped where it doesn't belong, can create oxidative stress. That's like a slow burn on the inside, damaging cells one by one." Ryker nodded, picturing those slow burns, imagining the strain of constant repair work. He realized then that even if numbers on a chart returned to normal, the memory of what caused the damage had to stay with you, guiding your choices. After that, his relationship with iron supplements changed completely. He took them with a kind of reverence, respecting their power, but never underestimating their danger. Blueberries no longer came anywhere near the hours he scheduled for his iron dose. He'd sometimes joke to Ellen that the berries and the pills weren't on speaking terms anymore. But beneath the humor was a line he would never cross again. One afternoon, Frank stopped by, rubbing his hands together against the autumn chill. They sat on the porch with steaming mugs of tea, and Frank mentioned he'd been feeling tired lately. "Doctor says my iron's low," he said, thinking about starting a supplement. Ryker leaned forward, telling him about Margaret, not in a preachy way, but as a caution. He described her smoothie, the hidden reaction, and the long months of recovery. Frank listened, his expression tightening. "I'd have never thought," he murmured. Ryker shrugged. Neither did she. That night, as the wind rattled the last of the leaves from the trees, Ryker felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because he'd convinced Frank of anything in particular, but because sharing the story felt like part of the healing. Margaret's scar wasn't his, but the lesson was one he'd carry for the rest of his life. It was a reminder that health wasn't just about adding good things in. It was about knowing when even the best intentions could turn against you and having the courage to change course before it was too late. When Ryker thought about Margaret's recovery, what struck him most wasn't the medicine or the hospital visits. It was how simple the turning point had been. After weeks of pain, fatigue, and numbers on her blood work that had frightened even her doctor, the thing that finally allowed her liver to begin healing was separating her blueberries and iron supplements by several hours. That was it. One small, almost ordinary change, repeated every day without fail. Her doctor had explained it to her in a way that Ryker later remembered clearly. "Your body needs space," she'd said. "When you give it the chance to process one thing before the other, you're removing the constant fight." For Margaret, that space was 4 to 6 hours, enough time for the iron to be absorbed before any blueberries could swoop in with their tannins and polyphenols, binding the mineral and trapping it in her organs. It sounded simple, but it required discipline. She had to rethink her mornings, her snacks, even her social meals. In the first 2 weeks, Margaret noticed her nausea easing. The tight ache in her side began to loosen, no longer pulling at her every time she bent or reached for something. By the end of the first month, she had an appetite again, enough to sit at the table with her daughter and grandson and eat without wincing. Her liver enzymes, once dangerously high, began to inch their way back toward normal. Ryker remembered hearing how she'd marked the progress on a calendar, not with numbers, but with little notes about how she felt each day. "Better sleep," one square read. "Less tired in the morning," another. He liked that approach. It reminded him that healing wasn't always about charts and test results. It was about noticing the quiet returns of the things you thought you'd lost. By the 4th month, Margaret's scan showed no new iron deposits. The chelation therapy had done its work, but it was the simple separation, the conscious decision to keep blueberries and iron apart that had given her liver the breathing room it needed to recover. Ryker thought about that often. It made him wonder how many of the people he saw at the market or the cafe were carrying their own hidden battles, not realizing that the solution might be a small shift rather than a drastic overhaul. One rainy afternoon, he told Ellen, "It's strange how something so small can turn the tide." She was kneading dough at the counter, her hands dusted with flour. "Small things add up," she said without looking up. "So do small mistakes. The trick is knowing which ones to keep and which ones to let go." Ryker nodded slowly, realizing she was right. For Margaret, one choice each day had been enough to save her health. For him, that was the kind of lesson worth holding on to. By the time autumn rolled in, Ryker's relationship with blueberries had shifted completely. They were no longer just a sweet, colorful habit on his plate. They had become a thoughtful choice, a food he treated with the same respect he gave his medications. The days of tossing them into any bowl or blender without thinking were gone. Now, each time he reached for them, he thought about what they'd be sharing space with, the way you might think about who to seat together at a dinner table. It was Ellen who first suggested pairing them with oatmeal. One chilly morning, she set down a steaming bowl in front of him, soft oats, a sprinkle of cinnamon, and a generous scoop of blueberries on top. The first bite felt like comfort itself, but there was something else too. A steady, satisfying energy that carried him through his morning walk without the dips and slumps he used to feel. "The oats slow everything down," Ellen explained with a smile. "Keeps the sugar steady so you don't get that rush and crash." He didn't need much convincing after that. Over time, Ryker found a few other favorites, a handful of walnuts alongside his berries in the mid-morning. The subtle crunch, the faint bitterness of the nuts, seemed to make the blueberries taste even sweeter. One afternoon, he read an article at the library about how the healthy fats in nuts help the body absorb certain compounds from berries more effectively. He tucked that bit of knowledge away, but truth be told, he'd have kept eating the combination even without the science. It just felt good. Dark leafy greens were a surprise discovery. Ellen had made a salad of spinach, kale, toasted seeds, and scattered blueberries across the top for color. Ryker had raised an eyebrow at first, but the tangy sweet bursts against the earthy greens made for a pairing that was not only delicious, but left him feeling lighter afterward, not weighed down the way heavier lunches sometimes did. "Guess the doctor's right," he said between bites. "These two get along just fine." Then there was green tea, his afternoon ritual on cooler days. He'd never thought much about what to have with it until one day he set a small bowl of blueberries beside his cup. The pairing was quietly perfect. The gentle bitterness of the tea seemed to draw out the richer notes in the berries, and the warmth of it all left him calm but alert. It was the kind of simple pleasure that made the late afternoon feel like its own small reward. Dark chocolate was the indulgence he almost didn't believe could be good for him, but a square or two of the rich, slightly bitter chocolate alongside a few blueberries became his end-of-day treat. Sometimes he'd share the plate with Ellen, both of them savoring the slow melt of the chocolate and the bright burst of the berries. "If this is what eating smart looks like," she teased one evening, "I think I can manage it." For Ryker, these new pairings weren't about restriction anymore, they were about discovery. He felt as if he'd been reintroduced to blueberries, not as a habit, but as a partner in his health. Each thoughtful combination was a way of honoring what he'd learned and of giving his body the best chance to take in every bit of good those berries had to offer. The first time Ryker paired dark chocolate with blueberries, it wasn't because he had read some research paper or heard a doctor's recommendation. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday evening when Ellen had been baking a chocolate tart for the neighbor's birthday. She'd left a few pieces of dark chocolate on the counter while the tart cooled, and beside them sat a small bowl of blueberries they hadn't eaten at lunch. Ryker, leaning against the counter, reached for one of each without thinking. A square of chocolate, then a blueberry. The moment was unremarkable in every way except for the taste. The richness of the chocolate seemed to wrap around the bright sweetness of the berry like a warm coat, and he found himself closing his eyes for a second longer than necessary. Ellen caught the look and laughed. "You'd think I just handed you a fine glass of wine," she teased. Ryker grinned but didn't answer. He was too busy reaching for another pair. A week later, at his next appointment, the conversation took an unexpected turn. His doctor mentioned a recent study about flavonoids in dark chocolate and blueberries, how they work together to improve blood flow to the brain and heart. She explained it in plain words. "Think of your blood vessels as narrow country roads. These compounds help keep the roads clear and flexible so more traffic, more oxygen can get through. Ryker thought back to that moment in the kitchen and felt an odd sense of satisfaction, as though he had stumbled onto a secret his body already knew. From then on, he began to think of dark chocolate not as a guilty pleasure, but as a small tool in his health kit, one that happened to taste better than most. He didn't overindulge. A square or two was enough. In the afternoons, when the light in the living room turned golden and the house was quiet, he'd make a small ritual of it. A plate with a couple of dark chocolate squares, a handful of blueberries, and a mug of green tea. He found that slowing down to enjoy them rather than eating on the run made the experience feel almost meditative. One Saturday, Frank came by while Ryker was setting out his afternoon plate. "Chocolate and berries?" Frank asked, raising an eyebrow. "Trying to make dessert healthy?" Ryker chuckled. "Not trying, succeeding. This isn't just dessert, it's brain food." He told Frank about the research, how the flavonoids could help keep blood vessels open and flexible, how better circulation meant more oxygen to the brain, and how that could sharpen memory and even improve mood. Frank listened, half amused, half intrigued, and finally asked for a plate of his own. Over the weeks, Ryker began to notice subtle shifts. He wasn't expecting miracles. At 72, he knew better than to think any one food could turn back the clock. But there were days when his thoughts felt clearer, when names and details came to him faster in conversation. His morning crossword seemed a little easier. Whether it was the chocolate, the berries, or simply the joy of the ritual, he couldn't say for certain, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he felt engaged, alive, and still learning. Ellen noticed it too. One evening, as they sat in the den reading, she looked over the rim of her glasses and said, "You're sharper these days. Quicker." Ryker smiled. "Must be the chocolate," he said, though they both knew it was more than that. It was the combination of food, of attention, of the small, deliberate choices he made every day to give his body what it needed. The science fascinated him. He learned that the flavonoids in dark chocolate could stimulate the production of nitric oxide, a compound that helped blood vessels relax and widen. Blueberries brought their own powerful compounds, anthocyanins, which protected the lining of blood vessels and reduced inflammation. Together, they weren't just feeding his taste buds, they were working quietly in the background, like skilled craftsmen repairing a bridge while traffic kept moving. Sometimes he'd share this knowledge with Ellen over dinner, and she'd listen, nodding, but with that half smile that meant she was happy he was enjoying himself. Other times, he kept it to himself, simply savoring the quiet connection between what he ate and how he felt. One late afternoon, he invited his granddaughter Lily to join him in the kitchen. She was helping Ellen with cookies, but Ryker offered her a small piece of his dark chocolate and a blueberry. She popped them into her mouth together and widened her eyes. "That's really good," she said. Ryker laughed. "Good for you too, believe it or not." He didn't go into the details. She was too young to care about nitric oxide and blood flow, but he liked the idea that the pleasure of the pairing could be passed down, along with the knowledge when the time was right. As the months passed, the pairing became a fixture in his routine. It was a small anchor in the day, something to look forward to no matter what else was going on. On rainy afternoons, he'd sit by the window with his plate and tea, watching the drops streak the glass. On sunny days, he'd take it out to the porch, feeling the warmth on his face as he savored each bite. It wasn't indulgence, it was intention. And with intention came peace. Ryker knew he couldn't control everything about aging, the slow creak of his knees in the morning, the silver spreading through his hair. But he could control this. He could choose to give his body small, consistent gifts that added up over time. The chocolate and blueberries were just one example, but they were a delicious reminder that health didn't always have to taste like compromise. One evening, as Ellen cleared the plates after dinner, she paused and looked at him. "You know," she said, "for someone who's had to change so many of his eating habits, you've ended up with a pretty sweet deal." Ryker smiled, holding up the last square of chocolate before letting it melt slowly on his tongue. "Sweet," he said, "and smart." And in that moment, with the rich taste lingering and the quiet comfort of the evening settling in, Ryker felt certain of one thing. Sometimes the best medicine came not in a bottle, but in the small, thoughtful pairings that made life not only longer, but better. By the time winter's first frost rimmed the windows, Ryker had been eating blueberries in a whole new way for months, They were no longer just a breakfast habit, they had become something he looked forward to, a quiet anchor in his day. The more he enjoyed them, the more he noticed small changes, ones he might have missed if he hadn't been paying attention. His morning walks felt lighter, his hands didn't ache as much after pruning the roses. And there was a kind of steady clarity in his thinking, as though the mental fog that sometimes rolled in during long afternoons had thinned. He'd never been the type to count vitamins or track nutrients on paper, but he liked knowing there was substance behind the changes. One evening, over tea, his doctor had explained that blueberries were loaded with antioxidants, tiny compounds that worked behind the scenes to protect his cells from wear and tear. "It's like patching a roof before the rain comes," she'd said. That image stuck with him. He liked thinking of his body as something worth maintaining, not just fixing when it broke. Ellen noticed the difference too. She'd comment on the color in his cheeks after a brisk walk, or the way he could kneel down to check the bottom shelf in the pantry without groaning. "You're moving like you used to," she told him one afternoon. Ryker smiled, though he knew it wasn't about moving like he used to. It was about moving well enough for the life he wanted now. The berries, he realized, weren't working alone. They were part of a web of habits. The better food pairings, the new timing with his supplements, the daily walks, the effort to sleep a little earlier. But the blueberries had a way of tying it all together. They fit into his life without resistance. They didn't require a recipe or a schedule. They were easy to reach for, easy to enjoy, and in that simplicity was their power. One Sunday afternoon, Lily visited with her sketchbook. She sprawled across the living room rug, drawing pictures of the family. Ryker sat nearby, peeling a mandarin for her, careful to keep the citrus for her plate and the blueberries for his own. "Grandpa," she said without looking up, "how come you eat those berries every day?" He thought for a moment, then said, "Because they help me feel like myself." She nodded as if that was reason enough, and maybe it was. In the weeks that followed, Ryker found himself quietly grateful for the small bowl of berries on the counter. He knew their benefits went deeper than he could see, protecting his heart, keeping his mind sharp, easing the strain on his joints. But what mattered most was how they fit into the rhythm of his days. They were a reminder that caring for yourself didn't have to mean grand gestures. Sometimes it meant reaching for something simple, over and over, until it became part of who you were. When friends asked him about the changes he'd made, he didn't launch into science or lists. He told them stories about feeling steady on his walks, about sleeping better, about the pleasure of eating something that tasted good and did good at the same time. "It's not magic," he'd say, "but it feels close enough." And as he spoke, he realized that was what aging well meant to him now, not chasing youth, but tending to what he had so it would last. Ryker had always thought that as long as he was eating the right foods, the when didn't matter much. Morning, afternoon, evening, a blueberry was a blueberry, wasn't it? But one chilly afternoon in early spring, his doctor surprised him with a simple truth. Timing could be the difference between getting the full benefit and losing half of it. She explained that eating blueberries at certain times of day could change how the body absorbed their compounds, how steady the energy felt afterward, and even how well his digestion handled them. Her advice was clear. For someone his age, mid-morning or early afternoon was best. By then, his body was fully awake, his blood sugar steady, and his stomach ready to process the fruit without sharp spikes or dips. Eating them first thing on an empty stomach, she said, could leave him lightheaded or shaky, especially if he'd been fasting overnight. And pairing them with heavy evening meals meant his body would be too busy breaking down larger foods to take in the berries' full goodness. Ryker thought about his old habits. He remembered those rushed mornings when he'd toss blueberries onto cold cereal the moment he woke, then wonder why he felt a little dizzy on his walk. Or the nights when dessert meant a bowl of berries after a rich dinner, leaving him bloated and restless in bed. Suddenly, the patterns made sense. From then on, he treated his blueberries like a midday appointment. Around 10 or 11, after his morning walk and a light breakfast, he'd settle into his favorite chair by the window with a small bowl. The light would spill across the table, and he'd eat slowly, each bite feeling like both a treat and a quiet investment in his health. Sometimes, if the day was busier, he'd save them for after lunch, a sweet pause before the afternoon began. Ellen noticed the shift. "You seem more even," she said one day. "Like your energy isn't jumping up and down anymore." Ryker smiled. He hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. The mid-morning ritual left him steady, without the peaks and crashes that used to nudge him toward an extra cup of coffee. One weekend, Frank stopped by mid-morning and found Ryker with his bowl of berries. "Breakfast late today?" he joked. Ryker shook his head. "Breakfast was hours ago. This," he said, holding up a blueberry between his fingers, "is right on time." He explained the reasoning, watching the way Frank's grin softened into curiosity. It wasn't a lecture, just one more quiet piece of knowledge he was glad to share. The change felt small, almost too simple to matter, but Ryker could feel it in his days. The steadier energy, the calmer digestion, even the better sleep when his evenings were lighter. Timing, he realized, was more than a detail. It was part of the whole picture, the way the pieces of a puzzle had to fit just so before the image came clear. And now that he had found the right place for his blueberries in the rhythm of his day, he had no intention of moving them again. By the time spring sunlight began streaming warmly through the kitchen windows again, Ryker's blueberry routine had become second nature. The bowl on the counter, the careful pairings, the timing, they were woven so seamlessly into his days that he no longer had to think about them. But every so often, as he rinsed the berries under cool water, he'd remember how different things had been just a year ago. Back then, he'd eaten them without thought, mixing them with anything and everything, believing that more was always better. He hadn't realized how small habits, repeated daily, could quietly tilt the balance toward harm. One rainy morning, Ellen found him sitting at the table with his mid-morning bowl, watching raindrops race down the window pane. "You're quiet today," she said. Ryker smiled faintly. "Just thinking how close I came to getting it wrong," he admitted. He told her how Margaret's story still lingered in his mind, how easily her smoothie habit had slipped into dangerous territory. "Makes me wonder how many other folks are making the same mistakes without knowing it," he said. Ellen nodded, her eyes soft. "That's why you share what you've learned." And he did. At the market, he'd chat with neighbors about what worked for him, separating iron supplements by hours, avoiding dairy with berries, skipping the citrus pairing. He never made it sound like a lecture. Instead, it was always part of a story, about his walks, about the steady energy he felt now, about how small changes had given him more good days. People listened more when it was personal. Frank was one of those who listened. Months after their first conversation, he stopped by one afternoon and handed Ryker a small bag of walnuts. "For your blueberries," he said with a grin. "Haven't touched the dairy combo since you told me." Ryker laughed, feeling that quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing your own lessons have rippled outward. Still, Ryker was careful never to fall into the trap of thinking he had it all figured out. He kept listening to his body, noting how his stomach felt, how his energy held up, how well he slept. If something felt off, he adjusted. The ritual wasn't fixed in stone, it was a living part of his life, flexible enough to meet him where he was. One bright Saturday, Lily came for a visit. She spotted the bowl of blueberries on the counter and reached for a handful. "Grandpa," she asked between bites, "why do you eat these every day?" Ryker thought for a moment before answering. "Because they remind me to take care of myself," he said, "and because they taste good." She grinned. "Then I'm having some too." As he watched her pop the berries into her mouth, Ryker felt a deep sense of peace. His daily berry ritual wasn't dangerous anymore. It was one of the safest, simplest parts of his day. But it was only safe because he'd learned to see the whole picture, to treat the fruit not as a magic cure, but as a partner in his health. That awareness, he realized, was the real gift. And so, each morning, as he set the bowl on the counter, Ryker wasn't just preparing a snack. He was quietly honoring the lessons he'd learned, from his own experience, from Margaret's near miss, from the slow unfolding of knowledge over time. The blueberries were the same as they'd always been. The difference was him. In the quiet span of a single year, Ryker's life with blueberries changed in ways he never imagined. What began as a harmless habit, a morning bowl of yogurt, berries, and a splash of citrus, became the starting point for lessons that touched every corner of his health. He discovered how the smallest combinations could unsettle his body, how timing could double or halve the benefits, and how even good foods, in the wrong company, could quietly chip away at his well-being. Along the way, he met stories that stayed with him, like Margaret, whose daily smoothie nearly cost her health, and friends like Frank, who began to see their own routines differently. Each turning point brought Ryker closer to a truth he could feel in his bones. Aging well isn't about holding on to the past, it's about adapting, learning, and choosing with care in the present. He didn't stop eating blueberries. He simply learned to honor them, pairing them with foods that lifted their benefits. giving them their own space in his day and treating them as partners in his health instead of unquestioned comforts. In doing so, he reclaimed not only his energy and clarity, but also the quiet confidence that comes from listening to his body's signals. And that's the message Ryker would want you to hear. It's never too late to look closer at the habits you've carried for years. Sometimes the change that keeps you strong, steady, and thriving isn't a grand overhaul. It's a handful of small, thoughtful adjustments, made over and over until they become part of who you are. So today, take one thing you do for your health and give it your full attention. Listen, adjust, and let the smallest choices open the door to your strongest days ahead.